Lake Tahoe is one of the most beautiful natural landscapes in the entire United States. Located on the border between the states of California and Nevada, it stands out from other lakes because it is alpine. That is, it's hidden among the Sierra Nevada mountains, which also makes its freshwater much clearer than usual. Its beauty makes it a tourist destination at any time of year, but especially in the summer, when different hiking groups organize excursions along the various mountain trails, with the most popular being Ship Flats, which is located in Washoe County, Nevada. In general, Lake Tahoe has always been known for its beauty and for being one of the most popular tourist destinations in the area. However, during the summer of 1982, Ship Flats made headlines across the country. Not because of those good qualities, but because of a rather grim discovery. It happened on July 17, 1982, when a group of hikers took the Monte Rose Road to climb to the top of one of the mountains. The first few hundred meters were... Everything went completely normally, but toward the end of the route, two of the hikers decided to separate from the group to take a lesser-known path to the highest point of the mountain range. They had only been away from the main group for a few minutes when, on a log among the underbrush, they spotted what seemed to be a person lying on the ground. At first, they thought it might be someone who was injured, so naturally they hurried over to offer help. However, as they got closer, they realized there was nothing they could do to help. Lying face down, with men's underwear over her head, was the lifeless body of a woman. Obviously, the hikers immediately called the Washoe County Sheriff's Office, which sent a couple of its officers, under the command of Commander Bill Matthews. Although the team was more than prepared to process the scene, the truth is there wasn't much work they could do. Although the discovery had been made near a fairly popular hiking trail, it was still a remote place where there weren't people around all the time, and therefore there were no potential witnesses to question, other than the group of hikers who found the body and maybe another group of people who were in the area, but who also hadn't seen or heard anything. The scene was unusual not only because of its location, but also because of the lack of evidence. Unlike any other crime scene, in this one, there was no object or element to process, besides the body and the piece of underwear over its head, so the officers' work at the scene was fairly quick. After cordoning off the area and talking to the hikers who had made the discovery, the officers approached the body for the first time while they were still waiting for the coroner. When they removed the underwear that was over the corpse, the cause of death became clear. The victim had 2 bullet wounds, one at the nape of her neck and the other at the base of her head. A closer look at the body allowed them to realize that, in addition, the woman showed several signs of abuse. But even though they searched her clothes for any identification or clue that could help uncover her identity, they couldn't find anything. Thanks to the report made by the forensic specialist in charge of collecting the body, we know that the victim, a woman between 25 and 35 years old, was wearing blue jeans, cream-colored sneakers, and a blue tank top that matched the one-piece swimsuit of the same color she had underneath. Physically, she was described as a young woman, about 1.65 meters tall, with hazel eyes and long brown hair, which, at the time she was found, was tied in a bow. As for the condition of the body itself, the forensic doctor determined that the decomposition process had not begun, and therefore the homicide had not been committed long before the discovery. Since this was the only clear clue they had to start the investigation, some of the commander's men began a sort of decomposition, a sort of search in the area around the lake at that very moment. They carried with them the photos that had been taken of the body. Those officers went around the area not only looking for any evidence that could help them with the case, but also asking people they came across if, by any chance during their walk, they had seen the victim. Despite their efforts, they didn't get any information this way either. It was only when they moved the body that the officers noticed a series of footprints that hadn't been visible before. One set of footprints seemed to match the victim's shoes. The second set, however, didn't match the shoes of the hikers or the officers, so they concluded that they probably belonged to the killer. especially because the marks from those shoes seemed to appear out of nowhere, right next to the victims. And from where the body was, they led toward the opposite side. The detectives paid special attention to following them, but this didn't lead to any breakthroughs either. The shoe prints crossed the trail until they reached the road, where they disappeared, which seemed to indicate that the killer, or at least the person who had briefly walked with the woman, returned to the road to get into their vehicle. However, beyond this theory, there was no other element that could help the investigation. As you can imagine, it was anything but easy. With no basic information about the victim and no significant evidence, the investigators' hopes rested on the autopsy, hoping that the examination could help them identify the woman and, with any luck, help them find whoever was responsible for her death. Since their next steps depended heavily on the forensic results, the sheriff's office did not make the discovery public right away. Before talking about the case, at a press conference, the decision was made to create a composite sketch of the victim to begin distributing it to more than 300 law enforcement agencies in the western part of the country, including, of course, those located in California and Nevada. The idea was for the various police departments to check if anyone matching the victim's description, or someone similar, had gone missing in their respective areas. However, this attempt was also unsuccessful, and to be honest, the autopsy report wasn't much help either. The autopsy confirmed that the woman was between 25 and 35 years old, and that, as had been observed at the crime scene, she was a victim of abuse. It was determined that the bullet, which had ended her life, was lodged at the base of her head, and thanks to the angle of the wound, the coroner concluded that she was shot while she was crouching, or at least leaning forward, probably tying her shoelaces. It was also detailed that the woman had a scar on her abdomen, which, along with certain other characteristics, led to the belief that she had been pregnant at least once in her life. Both the woman's fingerprints and dental records were entered into national databases, but they did not yield any results. This, along with the fact that she had vaccination scars, which were not common in the United States, led the coroner to think that the victim might not be American, but rather European or Canadian. This led investigators to focus on missing persons reports for women of those backgrounds, but that didn't lead anywhere either. Increasingly stressed by the lack of progress in the investigation, they decided to share the discovery with the public and also ask for their help. In fact, to increase the chances of people cooperating, the authorities decided to open an anonymous tip line and offer a $500 reward to anyone who provided information that could help them, whether to find the perpetrator or to identify the victim. They received about 35 tips, but all of them ended up being ruled out for different reasons. By the end of 1982, the police had investigated different hypotheses, including the possibility that she might have been homeless. But none of those theories led anywhere, so they shared their information with authorities in both Canada and Europe. And that didn't yield any results either. So, little by little, the investigation into the death of the Sheet Flats Jane Doe, as she became known, was put on ice. The woman's body was buried in an unmarked grave at Our Mother of Sorrows Cemetery in the city of Reno, and over the following months, the investigation continued without any progress being made. Officially, the investigation was closed 3 years later, with a clause requiring the Washoe County Sheriff's Office to periodically review national databases in an attempt to see if there were any new matches with the woman's fingerprints, or with her dental records. And if there's one thing to acknowledge in this case, it's that the authorities were committed not only by conducting those periodic reviews, but also by preserving everything related to this case in an exemplary manner, especially the sexual assault kit that the coroner collected from Jane Doe's body. It's important to keep in mind that the body was discovered in 1982, a time when it wasn't possible to identify a person through bodily fluids, unlike in current investigations. Detectives back then had no way to identify an assailant through semen. However, preserving the sample taken during the autopsy would be key to solving the case almost 40 years later. Although the authorities continued to occasionally check the national database, the case wasn't truly reopened until mid-2018, thanks to the persistence of one of the investigators from the sheriff's office. That investigator, at the beginning of the year, had attended a conference presented by Margaret Press and Colleen Fitzpatrick, a PhD and a forensic geneticist, respectively, who the previous year had founded the DNA Doe Project, a nonprofit organization that aimed to help identify victims of unsolved cases through genetic genealogy. All this time, I've been saying Jane Doe, and maybe there are people who don't understand that name because they haven't seen many cases like this. It turns out that Jane Doe and John Doe are names given to unidentified bodies in investigations like this one. Because, precisely, they don't have a name. That's why the project is called DNA Doe, because of the last name Doe that's given to the bodies. In case you didn't understand, in case you didn't know that detail. Now, this project had a new technique. Unlike what is traditionally used by police investigators, it didn't just search criminal or missing persons databases, but also all those public databases where people share their DNA to discover relatives or their ethnic origins. This makes it much easier to find matches, even if the percentages aren't very high. By searching these databases, it's possible to find people who share some segment of DNA, okay, with the unidentified person. And from those matches, geneticists who specialize in genealogy start building the family tree of those matches until they discover a common ancestor. Once they reach that family starting point, the geneticists reverse the process. At this point, they're not so focused on the biological work, but rather on an investigative process. They start triangulating information from the descendants until they manage to find a person who matches all the characteristics of the unidentified person. When they succeed, a standard DNA test is done between the sample they have and a direct relative who has been found. From the very beginning, the DNA Doe Project emphasized how useful genetic genealogy could be for investigating old unsolved cases. And the investigator from Washoe County who attended their conference, thank you, thought it was worth trying in the case of the Shipslat's Jane Doe. So in February 2018, he requested the case be reopened. He got permission a month later, at which point he contacted the organization to work together on the case. Since at that time the DNA Doe Project was working on other cases, it wasn't until April that the organization accepted the case and collected the samples kept by the sheriff's office to extract a DNA profile from them and upload it to GeneMatch, a completely open online platform that allows people to upload the results of their tests done with companies like MyHeritage or 23andMe in search of matches with other people. Within minutes, the DNA Doe Project found various degrees of matches, and based on those, their experts began to build the victim's family tree until they reached the Silvani family in the city of Detroit in the state of Michigan. The first thing they were able to identify with certainty about Jane Doe was her father, John Edward Silvani. An Italian immigrant who was born in France, he had 3 children, but only one of them was a woman. Mary Edith Silvani. Born on September 21, 1948, in Pontiac, a city considered part of the Detroit metropolitan area. Because so many years had passed, it was not possible to do a direct test between the victim sample and John Silvani. He had died in 1964, and his sons, Bob and Charles, had also passed away. However, by contacting the living relatives of the brothers and comparing their DNA with Jane Doe's, they concluded that the victim was not their sister, but their half-sister. Thanks to a direct test between Bob and Charles's children and the samples from the scene, the hypothesis that Mary Silvani was the victim was confirmed. The degree of certainty between their DNA profiles showed a second-degree relationship, typical between uncles and nieces or nephews. Through information found in public records, they determined the date Mary was born and were also able to obtain more information about her mother, Blanche Curry, a Canadian woman whom John had been married to for a couple of years, before she left him and their daughter due to mental health issues. So Mary was raised solely by her father until he passed away when she was just 16 years old, which meant she then came under the care of the state. With strong indications that Mary was Jane Doe, The organization handed this information over to the sheriff's office, which confirmed it when, after searching for Mary's name in their database, they found a set of fingerprints that had been taken from her in 1974 during a traffic stop. Those fingerprints matched the ones from Jane Doe's body. So, by that point, there was no doubt that they had been able to identify the woman. However, there wasn't much information about her. Her nephew, Robert Silvani Jr., who was the reason for the discovery, had never met his aunt. And even though he provided contact information for other relatives, the situation remained the same. So the investigators were forced to rely on the little official information they had about her. For example, the schools she had attended. Mary never had a stable home. And that was evident in the number of high schools she had gone to. However, thanks to the student rosters, they found several of her friends. The first was Nancy Cumming. She explained that she had met Mary in high school and that they quickly became best friends. In fact, their bond was so close that when she got married at 19, Mary was one of her bridesmaids, and to prove it, she had brought several photos with her. Another person who came forward was Paula Healy, who had met Mary at Mackenzie High School, where she attended her last years of high school, although there were no records of her graduation. Paula described her friend as a rather quiet girl, somewhat shy, but with a very good heart, who really liked to read as well as the arts in general. But she was quite reserved. She didn't like to talk about her private life or her family, so when they finished high school, they lost touch. Although these details helped to get to know Mary a little better, they didn't help illustrate her situation at the time of the events. So, little by little, the detectives started talking to all the friends and acquaintances from that time until they reached those who had been in a relationship with Mary after high school. Obviously, this wasn't easy and involved dozens of interviews over the course of several weeks. But finally, the detectives learned that Mary's life hadn't stabilized after she left the system upon turning 18. On the contrary, they found out that more than once she was forced to live on the street due to a lack of work or relatives to help her. And just when things seemed to be getting slightly better in 1972, she found out she was pregnant. She wasn't in a relationship and didn't have the means to take care of a child on her own, so shortly after giving birth, she put the baby up for adoption. A decision that was anything but easy for her. On the contrary, according to what her friends told the detectives, having to give her child up for adoption caused Mary to fall into a very deep depression, from which she was only able to recover by leaving Detroit. By that time, Mary had practically stopped talking to everyone around her, so people started to lose track of her, and none of them knew exactly what happened. At what point did the young woman leave the city to try to start over in California? Despite the sheriff's office's efforts, determining exactly when she had moved or where she had gone was practically impossible, so they had to settle for the conclusion that Mary had moved sometime between 74 and 82. Sadly, they also couldn't find anyone who had known her in that city. But considering that they didn't find any rentals in her name or a social security number during that time, the most logical conclusion was that she hadn't had much luck in California and ended up getting by with odd jobs, just like she had in Detroit. Obviously, identifying the victim was a much bigger breakthrough than anything achieved in the last 36 years. However, it didn't actually solve the case itself. What's more, it hadn't even helped to uncover who had ended Mary's life. So in the second half of 2018, the authorities decided to try genetic genealogy to analyze the fluid samples from the rape kit that had been taken from the victim's body. The process to identify the owner of the traces collected from Mary's body was practically the same as the one carried out months earlier. With the new technologies available, a DNA profile was extracted and uploaded to the GED match database, where a series of matches led the geneticists to a family in Dallas, Texas, and finally to James Richard Curry. To confirm that it was really him, the sheriff's office agents contacted his children and managed to get them to provide samples of their own DNA for verification. A simple test between those samples and the ones collected from Mary Silvani's body confirmed that James Richard Curry had been her killer. but he couldn't be brought to justice because he had taken his own life just a year after the events. Still, before we talk about that, let's take a closer look at who the murderer was, and especially what his criminal activity was. James was born on November 16, 1942, in Bexar, in a rather complicated family situation. According to some sources, he was not the child of a stable marriage, as was expected at the time, but rather the result of a chance relationship between a married man and a single woman from Dallas. His father never wanted to take responsibility, so his mother raised him with the help of her sister, giving him only her own last name, something extremely unusual and frowned upon at the time. Unfortunately, there isn't much information about the early stages of his life. We don't know where, even if he finished his studies, or what conditions he lived in with his mother and aunt. However, thanks to some records, we know that he started having trouble with the law when he was quite young. During the second half of the 1960s, that is, just after turning 20, he was arrested for theft and assault. Although there isn't any information about the incident itself, it's likely that this wasn't the first time James committed a crime, since he was sentenced to 20 years in prison. That is, one of the maximum penalties for that type of crime, as if it were something more habitual. That, combined with the fact that he was sent to serve his sentence at Huntsville Unit, one of the highest security prisons in Texas, leads us to think that, despite being quite young, James was a repeat offender, or at least a very aggressive criminal who needed to be confined in a much more secure institution than an ordinary criminal. Since we don't know exactly what year he went to prison, no, we can't say how much time. He served time in prison for a sentence, but it wasn't 20 years. In 1977, Curry was granted parole, although he was far from reformed. The documents regarding his release show that just a few days after regaining his freedom, James informed the authorities of his new plans. He left Texas to move to California, although he didn't settle in any of the big cities in that state. On the contrary, he moved to Wakena, a census-designated place in Northern California, with a population that didn't even reach 100 inhabitants. In that town, which was so unaccustomed to newcomers, a disappearance would occur shortly after James moved in. The novelty of having a new neighbor made many of the residents of this place very friendly toward Curry, especially James DeWitt Robinson. The age difference between him and the newcomer wasn't very big. Curry was 31 years old, while the local was 40, and that detail made them get along right away. In one of their first conversations, DeWitt, who was a locksmith, found out that Curry was unemployed and offered to teach him the trade. During the remaining months of 77, they were seen together, until the following year when the man disappeared for no apparent reason. We don't know exactly when in 78 he disappeared, but since it was such a small community, his absence was noticed very quickly. Even so, no one alerted the authorities. Since no one knew for sure whether it had been voluntary or not, the residents chose not to file any official report, even though most of them believed that James Curry had something to do with it. The first thing that made them suspect his involvement in the locksmith's sudden disappearance was that Curry started running his business almost immediately after the owner vanished. However, what really made people suspect him was the amount of money Curry started to have after his friend's disappearance. Before the Texan arrived in town, James DeWitt had received about $10,000 as compensation from a lawsuit for injuries against one of his previous employers. For many of the town's residents, it was very suspicious that Curry suddenly experienced a huge financial improvement right when DeWitt disappeared. Just to give you an idea, he went from being someone who had just gotten out of prison and arrived with no home or job to having enough money to buy things like a house in cash. And more importantly, he bought the Santa Clara Self-Storage, a storage unit facility located very close to Cruz Boulevard, a very popular area in the city of Santa Clara, more than 250 kilometers from where Curry lived. Even though there were clearly questionable activities, the community didn't involve the authorities, and that allowed Curry to start putting together various strategies to return to crime. In 78, for example, he traveled out of town without anyone knowing, obtained a permit to carry firearms, and also bought a 38 caliber pistol, which, together with the storage unit I mentioned earlier, he used in the following years to commit robberies and rap. Zess? According to sources, James Curry would steal in different areas of California and store in some of the available storage units the things he couldn't sell, such as driver's licenses and other documents. Owning Santa Clara self-storage not only gave him a source of income, which, while not very large, was steady, but it was also an extremely useful tool for his crimes. So Curry put a lot of effort into keeping the business running peacefully, which he managed to do for about 3 years, before things took a much darker turn at the beginning of 1982. It happened on February 17th of that year, when he had an argument with Richard Lemon Jr., a 38-year-old man from Bakersfield who rented several storage units to keep his 2 motorcycles, a pickup truck, and other items. Several items. The relationship between the two started off cordial and stayed that way for several months, until early '82 when they began to get along poorly and argued more and more often. From what we know, it's because Richard wanted to open his own storage business, since he wasn't happy with the prices James was charging him. Lemon's complaints, along with the news that he would be opening his own business, were not well received by Curry. So when he met his client again at Santa Clara Self-Storage, he brought with him the 38 caliber gun he had bought years earlier. He had already decided to end his life, and that's what he did on February 17th. He arranged to meet him at the storage units, and as soon as Richard showed up, he shot him in the head. After confirming that he was dead, Curry found an old wooden box from the storage unit that he used for himself and put his victim's body inside it. He sealed the box and stored it in the unit that Lemon had been renting up until then, without any remorse whatsoever. Curry decided to empty the unit of his victim's belongings, so he started giving away his things, including his motorcycles. Unlike the previous case, Richard's close circle did file a missing person report, which led the California police to start an investigation to look for him. Although he was searched for in several areas of the state at that time, detectives did not find any information that could help them locate Lemon. So the case remained open, with the main hypothesis being that he had been murdered or at the very least had taken his own life. The murder of Richard, committed in the winter of '82, was followed by that of Mary Silvani in July of the same year, but once again, no one connected Curry to the case, so he continued enjoying his freedom until the early days of '83, when he committed another murder, this time a multiple homicide. The events took place on January 2nd of that year in San Jose, another city in California, which was just over 5 kilometers from Santa Clara, where he had ended Richard's life, and more than 320 kilometers from where, months later, he had assaulted and cruelly killed Mary. Unlike his last attack, he did know his victims, Gerald and Shannon Novoselic. They were a couple, 39 and 34 years old, respectively, whom he had met by chance 2 years earlier at a Christmas party organized by a mutual acquaintance. During this party, James discovered that the couple worked in the same business as he did and were, in fact, the owners of the rival company. From that moment on, Curry began to behave quite strangely toward the Novoselics. For example, more than once, when they ran into each other at parties like that one, James would accuse Gerald of drinking too much and trying to pick a fight with him, even though no one ever witnessed these supposed violent episodes. The relationship, although always tense, never stopped being cordial among the three of them. That's why, at the end of 1982, Gerald offered James a .45 caliber revolver he was selling. They both agreed to wait until after the holidays and meet on January 2nd at the couple's apartment located in the city of San Jose. As we saw with Richard, James Curry acted in a premeditated way, especially with those he considered his business enemies. So that morning, he went to the couple's house with a plan in mind. He entered the apartment pretending to be extremely interested in the gun, and when Gerald showed it to him, he asked to hold it, even asking questions about how to use it. And suddenly, without warning, James aimed and, without exchanging a word, shot him at point-blank range, ending his life right there. With Shannon, he didn't act as quickly. Taking advantage of her shock, he forced her to guide him to where they kept the money, and after stealing $400 from her, he assaulted her several times before taking her out of her house to force her into his yellow Lincoln Continental. His initial plan was to drive to San Francisco International Airport, where he would catch a plane to a random destination. However, he would end up not going through with it. In the middle of the trip, Curry had to stop on Interstate 92 to relieve himself, leaving Shannon alone in the car for a couple of minutes. The woman didn't hesitate for a second and took advantage of those minutes to try to escape, managing to get a few meters away before her captor started chasing her. After several minutes of chasing her, Curry managed to catch her. He abused her again by the roadside and shot her right there. Since it was an open area, he put the woman's lifeless body in his car and drove a couple of kilometers to the Crystal Spring Reserve, where he abandoned it. Unlike his other murders, Curry had left several loose ends. Several neighbors had heard the sound of a gunshot, followed by what seemed to be a woman's screams, and had called the police, who arrived at the apartment and discovered Gerald's body. Hours later, his wife's body was discovered. From the very beginning, the police emphasized learning about the couple's social circle. By questioning their friends, colleagues, and family members, the investigators discovered James Curry, an ex-convict whom many described as strange and violent. Surprisingly, the detectives didn't have to look for him very long. On January 4th, Curry showed up at a police station to be questioned. The police, who already considered him the main suspect, had no problem leading him to an interrogation room where Detective Robert Morse began questioning him. He didn't have to pressure him much. Within minutes, James admitted to having ended not only the lives of the Novoselats, but also that of Richard Lemon Jr., telling them the details of the latter's death and where his body was. That same day, the officers obtained a search warrant for Santa Clara self-storage, and when they opened the unit Curry had indicated, they confirmed his story. Lemon's body was there. Obviously, James Curry remained in prison, but he never went to trial or was officially charged. Because on January 6th, while he was being held in Santa Clara jail, he managed to make an improvised rope, which he used to hang himself. Just minutes after he hanged himself, a volunteer delivering books to inmates passed by his cell and saw him, so he quickly alerted the officers, who made sure to take him down and even performed CPR on him until they managed to revive him. He was then transferred to San Jose Hospital, where he was admitted to intensive care and spent 24 hours on life support. During those 24 hours, authorities continued searching the storage units at Santa Clara Self-Storage. There, they discovered not only a .38 caliber pistol, but also several forms of identification. And what was even more incriminating, checkbooks in the name of James DeWitt Robinson. However, since they didn't find his body or clear evidence that he was dead, detectives couldn't determine whether he had been murdered or if Curry had simply robbed him. And clearly, he couldn't be questioned about it either. Officially, on January 7th, 1983, doctors decided to remove his life support, and James Curry died minutes later at 7:30 p.m. The name James Curry was completely forgotten until 2018, when the DNA Doe Project managed to link him to the samples found on Mary Silvani's body. Officially, on May 7th, 2019, the Washoe County Sheriff's Office announced the closure of the Ship Flats Jane Doe case. They had finally identified her, well, both her and her killer. And that's where we wrap up today's case, the case of Mary Silvani, which I've wanted to cover for a long time. It's a bit short, but it's definitely one of the most valuable examples out there of what genealogy is and what can be done with DNA. And it's an example of everything that can be done with cases that were forgotten so many years ago. Ultimately, I don't know if the ending to this story is satisfying because, well, the killer didn't really serve a sentence, but at least it was discovered. Anything about the victim, because they also weren't able to learn much about her. It's unfortunate in that sense, but it's also very important to make it known that this technology has helped in several Jane Doe and John Doe cases, some of which we've actually covered on this channel if you want to check them out. There are several cases where they suddenly got an identification thanks to all of this. Thanks to DNA. Before we finish, remember that I'll leave a link in the description so you can get CyberGhost VPN with a discount, plus 4 free months. Remember, it's worth investing in security. So, well, that's it for now, like I said before. Here are the channel members. Remember, you can become a member down below. There's a little button that says something like Become a Member, and with that, you can show up here on screen and get the videos before they're officially published on YouTube. So yeah, here's a new video for you. Here's a recommended video. You can subscribe by clicking on my face, and I'll see you in another video. Goodbye.